Hello everyone, welcome back to History 1151. In our last video, we discussed the early American Republic, from the end of the American Revolutionary War to the year 1812. The United States, which had just gained its independence from Great Britain, now found itself at war with its former ally and mother country, less than 30 years after its first conflict with the world's most powerful empire. A series of unresolved issues relating to U.S.-Indian relations and American sovereignty on the high seas caused the War of 1812. We will discuss this war and how it changed American society, prompting the so-called Era of Good Feelings. While Congress, at the bidding of President Madison, did not officially declare war on Great Britain until June of 1812, the two nations arguably had already been in a de facto state of war for several years. 1807 was the year in which the USS Chesapeake was attacked by the HMS Leopard, with several of Chesapeake's sailors being pressed into the British Navy. In 1809, diplomatic relations with Great Britain and the United States came to an end as well, due to the United States' continued trading with Napoleonic France, with whom Britain was at war. On the western frontier, unresolved issues led to friction between white American settlers and the Native Americans of the Old Northwest. Looking to prevent U.S. expansion and protect their holdings in Canada, the British-Canadian government had a long tradition of secretly supporting Native American tribes that were hostile to the United States. One such Native American leader, Tecumseh of the Shawnee tribe, sought to unite disparate Indian nations in the Mississippi River Valley together against continued U.S. expansion in the region. At the same time, Tecumseh's younger brother, Tenskwatawa, established a traditionalistic Native American spiritual movement that rejected European cultural influences. The brothers founded the settlement of Prophetstown in present-day Indiana in 1808. Prophetstown was the focal point of their pan-Indian, anti-U.S. movement. Tecumseh had grievances against both the United States as well as Native Americans that had accepted U.S. treaties. In 1809, at the Treaty of Fort Wayne, several Native American tribes sold their land in what is now Indiana to the U.S. government. Tecumseh declared that these tribes had no right to sell the land to white Americans. William Henry Harrison, the governor of the Territory of Indiana, declared that Tecumseh did not speak for all Native Americans and that the treaty was legitimate. Tecumseh told Harrison that if the treaty was not invalidated, then he would go to war with the United States. British agents in Canada were pleased with this development, but they urged caution on Tecumseh's part. This urging led Tecumseh to travel south, down the Mississippi River, where he hoped to make anti-U.S. alliances with the Native Americans of what is now Alabama and Mississippi. Most of the tribes in this region rejected Tecumseh's alliance overtures, except for the Red Sticks, a faction of the Creek Nation that wanted to live a more traditional way of life. While Tecumseh was away, Governor Harrison and Tenskwatawa faced off at the Battle of Tippecanoe on November 7, 1811. Tecumseh had urged the men not to fight until he had returned, but Harrison used a series of grievances, including horse thefts and the killing of several white settlers, as a pretext to camp right next to Tenskwatawa in Provincetown. On November 7th, 1811, Tenskwatawa and his warriors attacked Tippecanoe and Harrison. Harrison had about 1,000 troops, and Tenskwatawa had between 500 and 700 warriors. The battle was a victory for the U.S. and Harrison. The militia, commanded by Harrison, drove Tenskwatawa and his people from Prophetstown and then burned the settlement to the ground, a common strategy taken by Anglo-Americans in their wars against Native Americans, as we've seen before. The battle was a tactical victory for the U.S., damaging Tenskwatawa's reputation while increasing Harrison's, who would use the fame he had won at this battle to become America's short-lived 9th president. The battle also convinced Tecumseh that his Indian Confederation should be more closely allied with the British, who were looking for allies against the United States. After the initiation of the War of 1812, the United States began its advance on British Canada. Americans on the western frontier had longed to annex Canada, and war with Britain provided the perfect opportunity to seize control of this coveted territory, although Americans on the coast were more concerned about the impressment of sailors and the disrespect that Britain had showed towards U.S. national sovereignty. President Madison ordered the increase of the U.S. Army to 35,000 troops, but few Americans wanted to join the regular army, citing its low pay and strict military regulations. Americans preferred to fight in militias, as had been done in the American Revolutionary War. The militias performed in the War of 1812 in much the same way they did during the Revolutionary War. Militiamen could be effective when engaging in irregular warfare, but they struggled when fighting in pitched battles, or when they had been deployed far from home. Additionally, most militiamen could only serve for 90-day enlistments, meaning the militia was a revolving door for soldiers who could get very little training and combat experience before they would have to return home. The defensive and attrition-based strategy of the Revolutionary War, wherein the Patriots progressively wore down and outlasted the British Army, worked well with the militia's limitations. The War of 1812, which was initially fought in Canada and on the western frontier, exposed the militia's many weaknesses as a fighting force. With a small regular army and undependable militias, the U.S. invaded Canada, hoping to defeat the British in the region. The Americans, under General William Hull, invaded Canada north of the Great Lakes and tried to provoke a Canadian uprising against the British. Hull's appeals failed, and the British, the Canadians, and their Indian allies defeated the Americans, forcing them to retreat. The British and their allies then seized U.S. territory, capturing Fort Detroit and Fort Dearborn, near present-day Chicago. After the surrender of Fort Dearborn, Potawatomi warriors massacred the American POWs and their civilian relatives. 1813 was a somewhat better year for the U.S. on the northwestern frontier. William Henry Harrison, the hero of Tippecanoe, took control of U.S. troops in the region and adopted a more defensive strategy, allowing the British and their indigenous auxiliaries to come to him. Americans lost some battles at Frenchtown and at the River Raisin Massacre, in which American POWs were once again killed by the Potawatomi. The British had not sanctioned these killings, but the deaths of the prisoners strengthened American resolve against both Britain and Native Americans. (1813) also saw some important U.S. victories in the Northwest on the Great Lakes. The United States won a naval battle on Lake Erie at Put-in-Bay on September 10, 1813. Captain Oliver H. Perry defeated the British naval presence on Lake Erie, giving control of the lake to the U.S., which forced the British to abandon Detroit. 1 month later, General William Henry Harrison launched another invasion of Canada. On October 5, 1813, Harrison's force attacked the British and their Native American allies, including Tecumseh at the Battle of the Thames. The battle was a massive American victory. The British army was routed, and Tecumseh was killed in the battle. The Battle of the Thames secured the United States' control over the Old Northwest, and it brought Tecumseh's vision of an intertribal anti-U.S. confederation to an end. Although the battle was a victory, General Harrison had to give up his foothold in Canada, as his militiamen's 90-day enlistments were about to expire. The U.S. would invade Canada further to the east, in the Niagara Region, in 1814. The militia's endemic limitations, both in terms of training, discipline, and enlistment, would prevent the United States from achieving victory in this part of Canada either. At the same time, the U.S. was also fighting Native Americans who allied themselves with the British in the upper Mississippi Valley, what is now Iowa and Minnesota, meaning that the United States could not prioritize the Canadian campaigns. These fights would continue until 1817, 3 years after the War of 1812 officially ended. While the U.S. Navy aggressively engaged the British on Lake Erie, the American naval forces were much more cautious on the high seas. Britain had the world's largest, most powerful, and technologically advanced navy, and they had basically eliminated French naval forces, their greatest rival, at the Battle of Trafalgar back in 1805. The British destroyed or captured American naval ships, as seen during the battle between the USS Chesapeake and the HMS Shannon, the bloodiest naval battle of the war. The crews of the vessels fought each other hand to hand, and the British seized control of the Chesapeake's decks, leading her commander to admonish his sailors, "Don't give up the ship." This command is still a rallying cry in the United States Navy today. One U.S. naval vessel that was actually effective against the British was the USS Constitution. The Constitution was a heavy frigate. It was built using a new design, having a much thicker hull than the standard ship of her class. The Constitution, commanded by Isaac Hull, engaged the HMS Guerriere off the coast of Massachusetts. The British fired broadsides, synchronized cannon fire from one side of the ship, but their shots did little damage to the Constitution's thick hull. The Constitution, however, severely damaged the Guerriere, forcing her commander to surrender. The Constitution's design allowed this vessel to attack the British more aggressively, attesting to the importance of technological innovation in naval warfighting. The Constitution's power forced the British Admiralty to task several of their ships with the pursuit of this vessel, freeing up U.S. merchant maritime shipping. The Constitution is still in commission for the U.S. Navy today and can be visited at the Boston Naval Yard. Further to the south, in the lower Mississippi Valley, the British fought against the United States primarily through their indigenous allies. British troops did not arrive in the region in significant numbers until late 1814, and by then, the U.S. had become the dominant military power in the region. The Red Sticks, a faction of the Creek Nation that wanted to return to a more traditionalistic way of life, had been fighting with the lower Creeks, who wanted to live more like white Euro-Americans. The lower Creeks tended to live in low-lying valleys and plains in what is now Alabama and Georgia, while the Red Sticks lived in the foothills and mountains, hence their names. In the south, Spain joined Britain and the Red Sticks in their war against the United States. The U.S. also had far more indigenous allies in the south than it did in the Great Lakes region. Tribes like the Choctaw and the Cherokee both supported the United States, along with the lower Creeks, among others. Remember that Spain wanted to ally itself against the U.S. because it was losing territory to the United States in the Gulf region, and because Spain was at war with France during the Peninsular War, so Britain was a natural ally, being that Britain was Napoleonic France's greatest threat. The war in the Gulf South intensified after the Red Sticks attacked Fort Mims, a settlement in southern Alabama. The Red Sticks attacked the settlement, hoping to kill Creeks with mixed European and indigenous ancestry. The Red Sticks also killed between 400 and 500 white settlers who had taken refuge in the fort as well. The Fort Mims Massacre, as it came to be called, inspired thousands of Southern American men to join the militias to fight against both the Red Sticks and the British. One such man who joined a militia in Tennessee was Davy Crockett, the future U.S. congressman and martyr of the Alamo. In the Gulf South/Lower Mississippi region, the militia served alongside regular troops, and they were commanded by Colonel Andrew Jackson. With the arrival of additional militia and regular army troops, Jackson was able to defeat the Red Sticks at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend on March 27, 1814, forcing them to surrender. After the battle, Jackson, who was called Sharp Knife by many Native Americans, essentially stabbed his Lower Creek allies in the back, forcing them to give up most of their homelands, along with the territory of the Red Sticks. At the Treaty of Fort Jackson, signed August 9, 1814, the Creeks signed over about half of the state of Alabama and a good portion of Georgia to the United States. Even though many Native Americans had fought on the U.S. side during the War of 1812, the conflict caused an increase in anti-Indian sentiment among white Americans. With the defeat of the Creeks, Jackson turned his attention south to the Gulf Coast. Jackson invaded Spanish Florida, capturing the city of Pensacola in November of 1814. Americans had long desired to take control of the Gulf Coast east of New Orleans, then called West Florida, and even filibustered in the region in 1810. Although Jackson had the largest military force in the Gulf Coast, after defeating the Spanish, he ultimately ordered a retreat, back to New Orleans in late 1814, primarily due to the short enlistment terms of his militiamen, who made up the bulk of his army. In the spring of 1814, the Napoleonic Wars came to an end. Napoleon abdicated his throne and went to exile on the island of Elba. With the Napoleonic Wars seemingly over, Britain was able to withdraw its troops from continental Europe and deploy them in North America. The British High Command elected to attack and deploy additional troops in the Chesapeake Bay region, which contained the U.S. capital, Washington, D.C., and the major cities of Baltimore and Norfolk. These cities served as the U.S. Navy's primary bases of operation on the Atlantic coast. The British civil and military authorities believed that a quick strike at the U.S. Capitol and naval centers would force the Americans to sue for peace. If the British could capture Washington, D.C., and even President Madison, they could end the war on very favorable victory terms. The British sailed up the Chesapeake, disembarking in Maryland. The British Army commander, General Robert Ross, faced about 7,000 American militia and sailors. Ross himself had only about 1,500 troops. Though he was outnumbered nearly 4-1, Ross and the British absolutely defeated the American forces at the Battle of Bladensburg on August 24, 1814. The American commander, William Winder, had made several tactical errors, giving up high ground and the town of Bladensburg, positions that would have allowed him to play to the militia's gifting for fighting from cover. Instead, Winder tried to use his overwhelming numbers to crush the British. Ross used a brilliant series of tactics to defeat Winder's much larger force. Ross attacked the American left, enveloped it, cutting it off from the rest of the army. Without control of its flank, the Americans were unable to defend against Ross and the British, who were able to negate their inferior numbers by enfilading the entire American line. Enfilading is a military term for when one army has control of another army's flank. It can then use its position to fire upon the entire opposing force without them being able to return fire. The British regulars were not the only troops fighting for Britain during the Battle of Bladensburg. The British had also recruited enslaved African Americans, promising them freedom for themselves and their families if they fled to British lines and agreed to military service. The British formed these escaped slaves into the Colonial Marines Battalion. The Colonial Marines, though they were commanded by white officers, received the same uniforms and pay as the white English Royal Marines. Several thousand African Americans served in the British Army in the War of 1812 due to its promises of freedom. Free black Canadians, many of whom were descendants of escaped slaves, fought against the American invasions in Canada as well. Keep in mind that African slavery was still legal in parts of the British Empire, and slaves of masters in the British Caribbean colonies could not serve in the military unless given permission by their masters. In all, about 4,000 to 5,000 African Americans served in the British Army in the War of 1812, which is about half the number that served for the British military during the American Revolution. This number does not include African Canadians or Afro-Caribbean people who served in the British military during the War of 1812. African Americans also served in the U.S. military as well. While the U.S. Army did not officially allow black men to serve in its ranks, there were isolated reports of black men serving amongst U.S. soldiers. The U.S. Navy continued to allow black men to enlist. It is estimated that the 20% of American sailors during the War of 1812 were black. At the Battle of Bladensburg, as the militia retreated in disarray, a detachment of black American sailors who had been deployed on land refused to fall back, sticking to their guns. Free black men from the northern states, as well as Louisiana, formed their own local volunteer free men of color units, which functioned much like militias and were separate from the regular army. With the defeat of the militia at Bladensburg, Washington, D.C. was open to the British. General Ross captured the capital and burned down most of the city, including the White House, the Capitol building, and the U.S. Treasury building. The President and Congress had already fled, but Dolly Madison, the First Lady, remained in the city, gathering her things and her enslaved people. Contrary to popular belief, it was not Dolly Madison who saved the famous Gilbert Stuart portrait of George Washington. The painting was too high for Ms. Madison to reach quickly, so John Suze, the White House's French doorman, and Paul Jennings, a slave, cut down the painting and saved it from being destroyed by the British. After destroying Washington, the British continued on to Baltimore, where they planned to scuttle the Americans' fleet of privateer schooners, small, fast ships that had been raiding British maritime shipping. In order to capture Baltimore, the British would have to destroy Fort McHenry, which guarded the charmed city's harbor. It would have prevented the British from sailing directly into the city. At the same time, Ross's army approached Baltimore on land, engaging the militia outside of the city. In this fight, the militia performed better than they had at Bladensburg. They attacked the British with artillery and small arms fire, falling back when necessary. The militia even succeeded in killing General Ross, who fell to a sniper's bullet. With the death of General Ross, the capture of Baltimore became the responsibility of Admiral Alexander Cockburn, the British naval commander. On September 13, 1814, the British opened fire on Fort McHenry, hoping to reduce the redoubt, allowing them to sail into the city. The British shelled the fort for over 25 hours, striking its walls with thousands of cannonballs and rockets. Still, the stalwart Americans refused to surrender, or lower their non-standard version of the U.S. flag, the Star-Spangled Banner, which contained 15 stripes and was square. The British Navy's failure to reduce Fort McHenry led Britain to withdraw its force from the Chesapeake in preparation for an attack on New Orleans, where the last battle of the war would be fought. Before we talk about how the War of 1812 ended, we should discuss how Americans who were not immediately involved in the fighting responded to the conflict. As you remember, the Democratic Republicans generally supported the war against the British, viewing Britain's harassment of American shipping and sailors as a threat to U.S. national sovereignty. The Democratic Republicans also saw the war as an opportunity for territorial expansion, both into British Canada and into Native American lands in the South and Mississippi River Valley. The Federalists, in contrast to the Democratic Republicans, were more likely to oppose the war. The Federalists tended to be Anglophiles, wanting the U.S. to have a positive relationship with their former mother country. The Federalists were also less concerned with the impressment of American sailors, believing that the harassment of American vessels was the cost of doing business with Great Britain's enemy, France. As the war continued, the United States failed to gain ground in Canada, and the British invaded the Chesapeake region. The Federalists of urban New England and the Mid-Atlantic gathered together in Hartford, Connecticut in December of 1814. At the Hartford Convention, the Federalists listed the war and several other grievances, including the Louisiana Purchase, as proof that the Federalist Eastern states should secede from the Union. The Federalist secession plans never came about, because Great Britain and the U.S. signed the Treaty of Ghent on December 24, 1814, officially ending the war, taking away the Federalist primary motivation for secession. The Treaty of Ghent declared the War of 1812 to be a draw between Britain and the United States. Britain would maintain its borders in Canada, and it would evacuate its troops that had landed in Maine, which was then a part of Massachusetts. Britain would also compensate the United States for the escaped slaves that had fled to the British ranks. By this point, both Britain and the United States wanted the war to end and were willing to accept a status quo antebellum if it meant the fighting would cease. The Federalists' reputations would be further damaged after the Battle of New Orleans. The Battle of New Orleans took place on January 8, 1815. The most famous battle of the War of 1812 happened after the war officially ended. Neither the British forces in America nor the Americans knew that the war had come to a close. Word of the signing of the Treaty of Ghent would not reach the U.S. until February. As you remember, General Jackson had fallen back to New Orleans in the fall of 1814 to defend the city and allow his militiamen, whose terms had expired, to return home. Jackson faced a British expeditionary force that was over 8,000 strong and poised to capture the city. Jackson gathered together as many able-bodied fighters as he could. In addition to his regulars and militiamen and Choctaw allies, Jackson recruited Frenchmen, Spaniards, pirates, and African Americans, both slave and free, to build forts outside of the city and stop the British advance. There were even reports of women, primarily sex workers, going out with Jackson's army. Jackson even paid his white and non-white volunteers the same salary. Jackson's motley force was still outnumbered by the British, 5,900 to 8,000. The Americans used the region's natural features to their advantage, building their forts on a narrow strip of land that was surrounded by swamps and bayous and bodies of water, forcing the British to advance on their position along a narrow choke point. The British shelled the American forts with artillery, but a thick fog rolled in on the morning of January 8th and obscured Jackson's troops from view, preventing direct fire from the British artillerists. Without proper artillery support, the British force, under General Sir Edwin Pakenham, advanced on the American position, marching slowly across the wet, muddy ground. The American force fired with small arms on the British as they advanced, while also hiding themselves behind their hastily constructed breastworks, some of which were made of cotton bales. The Americans were also able to use their artillery at close range against Pakenham's troops, being able to see them through the fog from short distances, with decimating effects on the British. Jackson's outnumbered force fought bravely and forced the British to retreat. The Americans had even killed the British commander, Lord Pakenham. The Battle of New Orleans was a massive victory for the United States, greater than any other they had enjoyed during the actual war. The Americans killed, wounded, or captured over 2,000 British troops, 25% of their force, while losing less than 70 troops themselves. Additionally, the war had transformed Andrew Jackson into a national hero. Jackson would capitalize on this fame and become the 7th President of the United States. The war also produced heroes for the American people, like Andrew Jackson and William Henry Harrison, both of whom would become presidents. All in all, the United States was the biggest winner of the War of 1812, even if it had not technically won the war. The Americans had failed to take control of Canada, but they had demonstrated that they had the military might to resist the British Empire, both on the North American continent and on the high seas. Although the Americans had lost some important battles, they proved to the British that the United States could not be reintegrated into the British Empire. The Americans were their own distinct people, and they would fight to maintain their freedom and independence. Britain gained very little from the war, aside from its Canadian colonists developing an increased sense of nationalism that was rooted in their ties to the British Empire. Spain, in allying itself with Britain, had made itself even more an enemy of the United States than it had already been. Although Spain had supported the Patriots during the Revolutionary War, U.S.-Spanish relations had been in decline ever since the Louisiana Purchase, which Spain bitterly resented. Additionally, Americans had seized control of Spanish territory on the Gulf Coast, as seen during the filibustering raid of West Florida in 1810. Spain's support for Britain in the conflict took place on the backdrop of the ongoing Mexican War of Independence, in which Mexico would break away from Spain in 1821. Spain's alliance with Britain would also weaken its American empire, intensifying independence movements in South America as well. Spain would sell Florida to the United States in 1819 in order to prevent the U.S. from taking the rest of the territory by force. The U.S. had already begun to occupy the Panhandle region during the War of 1812. It would continue its occupation during the First Seminole War of 1814 through 1819. By the mid-1800s, the Spanish, who had once been the largest colonial American empire, had lost all of their territorial holdings in the Americas, except for the islands of Cuba and Puerto Rico. Native Americans also lost the War of 1812. In the years following the war, the British government stopped advocating for the interests of Native Americans in the Great Lakes region, fearing that doing so might provoke another war with the increasingly formidable United States. The war also destroyed Tecumseh's dream of a unified pan-tribal Native American resistance to the United States, and Tecumseh himself was killed during the conflict. In the South, the Creek Nation was forced to cede its lands in Alabama and Georgia to the U.S., opening up the region to white American settlement at a higher rate, and the expansion of plantation slavery into the Gulf South. Rather, the increased expansion of plantation slavery, namely through cotton in the Gulf South. The conflict also increased anti-Indian sentiment amongst white Americans, who would force the Choctaw and Cherokee peoples, their former allies, to leave their homes in the southeast for reservations in what is now Oklahoma. The years following the War of 1812 were called the Era of Good Feelings, lasting from about 1815 to 1825. This period of post-war optimism and prosperity bore many similarities to the economic boom the U.S. experienced after World War II. Americans enjoyed an increased sense of patriotism and national feeling. During the period, a new and distinct American culture, distinct from that of Britain, was on the rise. American values of democracy and egalitarianism, at least among white men, increased as well. For example, white Americans stopped bowing to men of higher social standing and instead would shake hands, a gesture of equality. Americans of all classes would also mingle together at parties and festivals and election day celebrations, as seen in this image. The Second Great Awakening, a religious movement that had begun in 1795, increased its fervor during the era of good feelings. Americans had a renewed sense of patriotism and national feeling during the War of 1812, but they also worried about the rapid social changes their country was facing. Second Great Awakening leaders, like Charles Finney, promised salvation to anxious Americans by emphasizing the importance of the conversion experience and being, quote-unquote, slain in the Spirit. Preachers, especially from the Methodist Church, spread similar messages across the American frontier. Like the First Great Awakening of the mid-1700s, the Second Great Awakening further democratized American Christianity by putting the burden of salvation on individual Christians through the conversion experience. The Second Great Awakening leaders also engaged with popular political ideas of the era of good feelings. Inspired by the American Revolution, the ministers preached the idea that average, everyday Christians could have a positive impact on society and could, quote-unquote, make heaven on earth by living a moral life and encouraging others to do the same. This belief about Christianity's role in society was called perfectionism. The reformist angle of the Second Great Awakening would help to inspire the Jacksonian and antebellum social reform groups in the North, like the temperance, abolitionist, and feminist movements, who called for the improvement of society through the control of alcohol, the emancipation of slaves, and granting equal rights to women. At the same time, the Second Great Awakening's emphasis on spirituality and social reform resonated with Southerners as well, though in different ways. Southerners took their own lessons from the movement and believed that they could improve society by spreading pro-slavery values. White Southerners in the 1820s began to believe that slavery was not a necessary evil, as the Founding Fathers did, but instead they came to view it as a positive good that improved the lives of black people, they thought. Slave masters believed that they should not set their slaves free, but instead treat them kindly and encourage them to follow Christian principles, like obedience. African Americans, including enslaved people, also took part in the Second Great Awakening, but they focused on the passages of the Bible that taught about liberation from slavery, like the Israelites' struggle for freedom during their enslavement in Egypt. African Americans also brought in elements of African spirituality, both beliefs and rituals, and incorporated them into their practice of Christianity. In the end, the Second Great Awakening increased American spirituality and religiosity, but it had the unintended effect of dividing the nation over the issue of slavery, inspiring anti-slavery reform groups in the North, while also giving white Southerners an increased rationale to defend the institution in the South. African Americans would also increasingly adopt Christianity on their own terms to inspire and justify their struggle for freedom. Even as Christianity flourished during the era of good feelings, other institutions, like the old Federalist Party, with its elitism, Anglophilia, and taste for social hierarchies, basically fell apart in the years following the War of 1812. The Federalists disintegrated as a political movement because of their attempted secession during the Hartford Convention, but also because American values, particularly those related to deference to the elite, were changing. The more egalitarian Democratic Republicans were triumphant, and the United States basically became a one-party state during the era of good feelings. In the 1816 presidential election, James Monroe of Virginia, the Democratic-Republican candidate, defeated Rufus King, a Federalist from New York. After winning his election, Monroe embarked on a nationwide goodwill tour, increasing national pride and everyday Americans' connections to their country. By the time of Monroe, the Democratic-Republican Party had changed since Jefferson. The Democratic Republicans had come to embrace some Federalist political policies, like tariffs and increased spending on infrastructure / internal improvements, like roads, canals, and harbors. The Democratic Republicans had also become less hostile to banks, founding the Second Bank of the United States in 1816. Finally, the Democratic Republicans had warmed to the idea of having professional standing armies and navies, recognizing that while militias had their uses, they would not be enough to defeat enemies in foreign territories, as seen during the War of 1812. Monroe also changed how the U.S. viewed diplomacy and foreign policy. Early U.S. presidents followed the lead of George Washington, who, in his farewell address, had urged the new United States to avoid entangling alliances and to remain neutral. Washington advocated for this dispassionate foreign policy stance because he understood that the new United States was weak and could not afford to make enemies abroad, especially of the European empires like Great Britain, France, or Spain. Monroe recognized that in the wake of the War of 1812, the U.S.'s position in the world had changed. Great Britain was still more powerful than the United States, but the war had showed that even if the U.S. could not defeat Britain, Britain could not recapture America. What is more, France had lost its most important colonial holding, Saint-Domingue, in the Haitian Revolution. Their power and influence had also been diminished by the defeat France sustained in the Napoleonic Wars and Napoleon Bonaparte's final exile to St. Helena in 1815. France was not the power that it had been at the time of Washington's presidency. Most importantly, in the 1820s, Spain, which was weaker than both Britain and France, was in the process of losing all of its colonial holdings on the North, Central, and South American mainland. President Monroe wanted to make sure that Spain did not try to retake its lost American empire, so he issued the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. The Monroe Doctrine condemned European colonialism and imperialism in the Americas and declared that the New World should belong to independent nation-states like the U.S. and the emerging Latin American republics. The doctrine also mandated that the U.S. would use both diplomatic pressure and military force to stop European colonizers from trying to rebuild their empires in the Americas. The Monroe Doctrine was a significant departure from the isolationist foreign policy proposed by George Washington. The U.S. was far stronger in the 1820s than it was in the 1790s, and all the European empires were weaker. Interestingly, Britain actually supported the Monroe Doctrine because the British government knew that the U.S. could not take Canada, and the British wanted to keep their European rivals, namely France and Spain, from trying to rebuild their collapsing American colonies. It is also worth noting that while the U.S. was quick to recognize the Criollo-run Latin American republics, the U.S. still refused to recognize Haiti's independence, for fear that doing so might start a slave uprising in the South. The U.S. would not recognize Haiti's independence and sovereignty until 1862, during the Civil War. The American nation was also growing, both over space and time, economically and technologically, during the era of good feelings as well. White settlers flooded into the Gulf South and the Mississippi River Valley, settling in territory that Native Americans had been forced to cede during the war. The nation was growing and its people were on the move. White Americans in the southeast coast moved into the states of Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, and many brought their enslaved people with them, setting up plantations in the Black Belt region of Alabama. The Black Belt had rich black soil, perfect for the growing of cotton. Cotton had become far more profitable in the early 1800s, due primarily to the invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney, a Yankee engineer from Massachusetts, in 1793. The cotton gin was a machine that spun a series of combs across raw cotton buds, removing the plant's seeds from the fluffy flour. This work had previously been done by enslaved people, who would slowly and painfully remove the seeds with knives. Whitney thought that he was helping enslaved people with his labor-saving device, but in some ways he made their lives worse. by making cotton plantations and slavery itself more profitable. The increased profitability of slavery would reinforce the idea in the minds of many white Americans that black people were meant to be slaves, and that slavery was not a necessary evil, as the founding fathers had thought, but a positive good, because it kept blacks subordinate to whites. And it also made whites wealthy. Wealthy Americans bought land in the West outright. But poorer Americans purchased land on credit, taking out loans from banks, which were all too willing to lend out money to buyers, as the banks would be able to take control of the land if the landowners failed to pay their debts. The problem was, the banks lent out too much money, and they overextended themselves. The Second Bank of the United States, BUS, failed to regulate state banks, to keep them from lending out money to buyers that could not pay it back. During this period, inflation increased, and many farmers on the frontier lost their land to the banks. One man who was struck by the 1819 panic was Andrew Jackson, the hero of New Orleans, who was serving as military governor of Florida during the First Seminole War at the time of the panic. Jackson blamed the National Bank, rather than the smaller banks that had loaned out too much money. He also blamed Monroe and the Democratic Republicans, whom he felt had betrayed their Jeffersonian principles. Jackson's experiences with the Panic of 1819, among other issues, would inspire him to run for president in 1824, and again in 1828, as the candidate for the new American political party, the Democratic Party, which still exists today. We will talk more about Jackson, his life, political career, and legacy in a future video. The Panic of 1819 was not the only thing that threatened to tear the United States apart during the so-called era of good feelings. The admission of two new states, Maine and Missouri, divided Americans who were pro and anti-slavery. Maine had originally been a part of Massachusetts, but its population increased in the years following the War of 1812, as the U.S. more firmly defined its borders in the region. Southerners opposed the entrance of Maine into the Union, fearing they would become a free state, upsetting the balance of power in Congress. Remember, there were no true political parties in the era of good feelings. Regional interests, frontier or urban, and pro-slavery and anti-slavery determined how people voted. Missouri also wanted to join the Union, and being that that region already had a large enslaved population, its white residents wanted to make sure the state would allow slavery. Northerners, anti-slavery people, did not want Missouri to enter the Union as a slave state, because they feared that if the state of Missouri allowed slaves, then slavery would expand into the rest of the Louisiana Territory. In the end, a compromise was made. The Missouri Compromise was as follows. Both Maine and Missouri would enter the Union. Maine would be free, and Missouri would allow slavery. All land in the Louisiana Purchase, north of the 30th northern parallel, Missouri's southern border, however, could only be turned into free states. Only the Arkansas Territory, which included the modern-day states of Arkansas and Oklahoma, could become slave states. The deal was negotiated primarily by Speaker of the House Henry Clay, a slave-owning congressman from Kentucky. Although Clay had made a deal that was far more beneficial to the northern anti-slavery wing of the U.S. government, since the vast majority of the Louisiana Territory would be free. The Missouri Compromise, in the end, had its good and bad parts. It was good in the sense that it prevented a civil war over the issue of slavery in the 1820s. It was also good in the fact that the deal basically stopped the spread of slavery in the Louisiana Territory, a win for anti-slavery people and slaves themselves. On the negative side, the Missouri Compromise would contribute to the increasing problem of sectionalism in the United States, the dividing of the United States into pro-slavery and anti-slavery sections, hence the term sectionalism. The Missouri Compromise further ensured that the North would be free and the South would be slave. Slavery would not be mixed up throughout the country. Rather, it would be confined to one part of the nation, making the secession of slave states far more possible. While the Missouri Compromise had prevented a civil war, at least temporarily, wise observers recognized the struggle between the pro-slavery South and the anti-slavery North would only get worse in the future. Thomas Jefferson, for example, the former U.S. president, did not celebrate the passage of the Missouri Compromise. Instead, he called it a, quote, fire bell in the night, end quote, seeing it as a warning of future conflicts to come. In spite of the Panic of 1819 and the contentious Missouri Compromise, the United States continued to advance technologically in the 1810s and 1820s. The Industrial Revolution had come to America. In 1813, Francis Lowell established a factory on the fall line of the Merrimack River in Massachusetts. Lowell's factory was hydro-powered. The falls of the river turned a water wheel that powered the factory's machinery. Lowell's factory turned the South's abundant cotton into cloth. It was a textile mill. The Lowell factory would expand, and a company town would grow up around the city. Factories like Lowell's lowered the price of cotton cloth, making it more affordable to everyday Americans, and indeed people across the Atlantic world, for whom cotton clothing had been previously too expensive for most people to buy. Lowell and other textile mills primarily employed young girls and young unmarried women. While work in the factories could be both unhealthy and dangerous, with long working hours, up to 73 hours a week, and minimal safety features, the factories gave working class women an opportunity to earn decent wages, to help themselves and their families. Lowell paid his female employees half of what he paid his male workers, but even the Lowell girls made $3 to $5 a week, a considerable amount of money at the time, considering an enlisted private in the U.S. Army, for perspective, made less than $7 a month. To ship these manufactured goods, the United States invested in internal improvements or infrastructure to move manufactured products and agricultural products to markets in major urban centers on the coast. This plan for infrastructure investment was called the American System and was advocated by politicians like Henry Clay of Kentucky. Canals were especially important for hauling goods, as a displacement provided by canal boats allowed a single mule to tow a canal boat that was loaded with more cargo than a wagon towed by a whole team of mules. Perhaps the most important of these artificial waterways was the Erie Canal, which was constructed from 1817 to 1821. The Erie Canal connected the Hudson River in New York City to Buffalo on Lake Erie. The Erie Canal provided an efficient water transport route from the East Coast to the Great Lakes. In addition to canals, Americans used natural waterways for the transportation of goods and people. We've already discussed the importance of the Ohio River and how it connected Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania to the Mississippi River during the American Revolutionary War. Goods could also be easily transported down the Ohio and Mississippi River and on to the city of New Orleans. Shippers used simple keelboats and flatboats to move the goods downriver, but it was far more difficult to move goods back up the rivers. Robert Fulton's 1807 steamboat, the Clermont, which traversed the Hudson River, convinced American investors that the new technology could be used to transport goods on the Ohio and the Mississippi. In the 1810s, about 20 steamboats plied the Mississippi and Ohio, but by the 1830s, over 1,200 were in use. Steamboats were expensive to outfit. A new steamboat cost about $25,000, about $400,000 in today's money. A steamboat that carried a full cargo from Pittsburgh to New Orleans, and then returning with a cargo from New Orleans to Pittsburgh, could pay for itself through shipping fees. Working on a steamboat could be very lucrative, but the job was very dangerous. Steamboats had few safety features. The work on the cramped vessels was hot and unpleasant, and the vessel's boilers were liable to explode, especially on the upriver trip, where the engines would have to be worked much harder to fight against the river's current. Nonetheless, fearless, enterprising men volunteered to work aboard these vessels. Steamboat work was especially desirable for African American men. Free black men could work aboard these vessels and receive a steady wage, while black male slaves who had been sent to work on the boats by their masters might gain a chance to escape when the vessels were docked in northern ports. Steamboat labor, though dangerous, was also desirable for immigrant men as well, who could use the boat's passage as an opportunity to explore their new homeland. Technology like steamboats and factories, financial institutions like state banks, and internal improvements like canals contributed to the massive economic growth the United States witnessed after the War of 1812, during the era of good feelings. As was the case with the War of 1812, the era of good feelings had its winners and losers. The winners of the era of good feelings were Americans who successfully adapted to the United States' rapidly growing and industrializing capitalistic market economy. Entrepreneurs who made good investments in technology, farmers and plantation owners who bought land in the West and paid off their debts, and banks that loaned money out to the right people all profited during this period. The losers were people who failed to adapt to the changing economy, either because they made poor investments, land that did not pay off, a boat that blew up, etc., or other things. Losers were also people who were not allowed to profit in this economy, black slaves who were denied the fruits of their labor, or Native Americans who had been forced to give up their land as a result of the War of 1812. So, the era of good feelings, just like the War of 1812, offered benefits for some, but it presented difficulties for others.